Welcome, everybody. I'm thrilled that you're all here with us this evening for a most wonderful occasion, which is to celebrate the publication of this remarkable book called Romantic Autopsy. I didn't reverse my video. So the event will last for an hour, and the format will be, I'll just do a brief introduction of the panelists. I will then hand over to colleague Rishi, who will do a part two of a sort of welcome and introduction. Arden will then speak for 8 minutes, and the three panelists will respond. So many of you, if you're here, you know Arden already. If you don't, you should, because she is one of the most extraordinary and valuable members of our community here at Columbia, both in the Humanities Center, in the English department, and elsewhere. Arden is a lecturer in the discipline of English and Comparative Literature and an affiliated faculty member with Medical Humanities, which is a program run through the Institute of Comparative Literature and Society, and Medical Humanities and Ethics, which is affiliated with the Columbia University Medical Center. She's been interested for a long time now in the intersection of medical knowledge with formalist and historicist literary approaches. And her research in Romanticism has been published in core journals such as European Romantic Review, Romanticism, the Byron Journal, and Keats Shelley Journal. She's also published in Partial Answers, Gender and Education, and Persuasions. Turn now to introduce our three panelists. Deidre Lynch is Ernest Birnbaum Professor of English Literature at Harvard University, and her most recent books include Loving Literature, A Cultural History, that was 2015, and the unfinished book, Oxford 21st Century Approaches to Literature, edited with Alexandra Gillespie in 2021. Next up will be my English department colleague, Rachel Adams, who's professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. She specializes in 20th and 21st century literatures of the United States and the Americas, disability studies and health humanities, media studies, theories of race, gender, and sexuality, and food studies. Her most recent book, which is riveting on every page, and I highly recommend, is Raising Henry, a memoir of motherhood, disability, and discovery, published by Yale University Press in 2013, and winner of the 2014 Delta Kappa Gamma Educators Award. Rita Sharon is a general internist and literary scholar who originated the field of narrative medicine. She's professor and founding chair of the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics and professor of medicine at Columbia University. She's the author of Narrative Medicine, Honoring the Stories of Illness, published by Oxford University Press in 2006, and co-author of Principles and Practice of Narrative Medicine, published by the same press in 2017, as well as co-editor of several important collections. Now, so we'll proceed through speaker and panelists. You audience members will ask your questions in the Q&A box, and when we reach the appropriate juncture, I will be reading questions out loud from that, and Arden will then answer them. So after all that, and with very much thanks for the hosting from the Humanities Center, and to Lindsay and to Kay and to everybody who's helped make this event happen, I now hand over to my colleague Rishi Goyal.
Thanks, Jenny. I am completely and truly delighted to have this opportunity to get to kind of celebrate and introduce Arden's work alongside Jenny and everybody that's here. Arden and I have been, sort of partners in crime, constant collaborators for a number of years, and I feel incredibly lucky to have the opportunity to work with her and kind of, get this opportunity to share some of my thoughts about kind of her work, but more importantly, maybe perhaps contextualize the work a little bit in our kind of shared academic and kind of intellectual interests. So I thought I'd talk a little bit for a few minutes just about kind of what we mean when we say the medical and health humanities, since this is something that the two of us and kind of everyone here has been working on to some degree. So when I think about it, the medical and health humanities is sort of a kind of a heterogeneous group of methods and ideas that engage the humanities and the social science disciplines, such as history, literature, anthropology, sociology, alongside scientific disciplines like biology, genetics, neuroscience, and biomedical engineering. These diverse fields are marshaled to emphasize a set of common principles that extend across disciplines, including the acknowledgement of the vulnerability of human bodies, an adoption of anti-essentialist approaches to biology, a sensitivity to discursive, rhetorical, and historical approaches that reflect how ideas about the body and health come to circulate and gain cultural traction. Just a few words about definitions or taxonomy, since I think Arden brings that up too. So medical humanities, what's that? It's the more established, I think, of the two fields. It's an interdisciplinary field that explores contexts, experiences, and critical and conceptual issues in medicine and healthcare, while supporting professional identity formation. Scholarship in the medical humanities is concerned with surveying and critiquing the disciplinary norms of the medical and healthcare context, while also training physicians and other healthcare professionals in approaches related to and or derived from the humanities. For instance, narrative medicine, as we have Rita here, and bioethics. In its focus on practical training, medical humanities has tended to emphasize educating what one scholar terms us in the God terms: empathy, listening, moral imagination, and self-reflection. There's been a more recent term to what we might call the critical medical humanities, which adopts a kind of decentering attitude as it applies a critical perspective to the implicit assumptions that structure the medical field. And now for health humanities, which is kind of its related term, and maybe a newer term, but one that's, I think, a little more difficult to define. It sort of came about in response to perceived limitations in medical humanities, which has a kind of narrow focus maybe on disease as opposed to the kind of more expansive concept of health. Health humanities scholars suggest that a health humanities approach looks both at and beyond medicine to critique its influence over cultural norms. This is more often situated in humanities departments than in clinical spaces, and it introduces the creative arts as well as traditional analytic disciplines. Health humanities adopts the characteristic attitude and study of the humanities, inclusivity, diversity, intersectionality, to an applied critique of the frameworks and institutions that govern healthcare and its effects on culture. I think it's more concerned with broader contexts, prioritizes a view beyond the medical humanities, sometimes narrow frame. Health humanities addresses a broad array of objects of study, such as disability, bias, structural inequality, aging, grief, suffering, and death. In addition to this diversity in its objects of study, health humanities draws on more of a capacious set of methodologic tools adapted from different humanities disciplines: close reading, as we see in this text, historiography, and qualitative assessment, to offer critical commentary on the influence of medicine and healthcare on human experience. Now, which brings me to kind of what we're doing today. So what makes Hegele's work so vital and valuable is that it approaches this disciplinary question from both the perspectives of the medical and the health humanities. Romantic Autopsy is beautifully written and incisively argued with astute readings of classic poems and novels like Tintern Abbey and Frankenstein. And if that's all it was, that would be enough to enshrine its status as a valued addition to our academic practice. But the book does a number of really important things in terms of expanding and developing the nascent fields of medical and health humanities. By taking seriously the protocols of Romantic literary production and readership and the protocols of Romantic medicine, and then highlighting their cultural exchange, Hegele teaches us how to read Adonais and In Memoriam better, but also how to better understand the pedagogic and therapeutic purpose of the case history in the postmortem. But Hegele doesn't stop there. She makes a further leap, which is crucial to the ethical impulse underlying the medical and health humanities. Symptomatic reading, in Hegele's hands and words, is an ethical reading practice that informs the care a physician or healthcare worker should take when treating a person and a body. The model of close and careful reading that pays deep attention to syntax, metaphor, and other tropes is the kind of gaze that Romantic physicians brought to bodies specifically because of the ways they learned how to read. And this literary historical study revivifies the practice of symptomatic reading in contemporary English departments, linking it to healing practices, while simultaneously empowering healthcare workers who care for all kinds of abjected bodies and peoples to embrace protocols of care embedded in close reading practices. I'd like us all to join together one more time to welcome and celebrate Hegele's wonderful achievement in Romantic Autopsy, literary form, and medical reading.
Oh, these are such wonderful words of introduction, and my heart is very full. Thank you very much, Jenny and Rishi, for your very kind words. And especially Rishi, thank you so much for contextualizing the book's intervention within medical and health humanities. It's really an essential opening for us. So thank you everybody for being here tonight. It's a huge honor to have you here. And although I wish I could see all of your faces in person, I'm glad for the virtual format, since it means that so many friends and colleagues outside of New York can be here tonight. And I look at the list of attendees and I think, oh, everybody's my favorite person. So thank you very much for being here. I am thrilled to be back here at the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities, a place where much of this book was incubated. I could spend all 8 minutes allotted to me in thanking everybody who is involved in the making of the book, but I also would like to tell you about the book itself. So I will just say a few quick words of thanks. I'm enormously grateful to the SOF Heyman, the Department of English and Comparative Literature, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics for supporting tonight's event. The full range of intellectual mentors who inspired the project is too long to list here, but I wanted to acknowledge my dissertation committee, as well as the fellows of the SOF Heyman, all of whom shaped the project in profound ways. I'm honored and frankly a little intimidated by my respondents tonight. It's a huge privilege to have you as some of the book's first readers. I imagine that Professor Deidre Lynch will offer the perspective of a romanticist on the book, that Professor Rachel Adams will speak about its relevance to health humanities from the point of view of a literary scholar, and that Professor Rita Sharon will explore how it might connect to narrative medicine and the clinical point of view of medical humanities. But our panelists may surprise us. Whatever vantage they may offer, it's a real honor to have each of you here, so thank you. Before we hear your thoughts on the book, I wanted to begin with a brief account of what this book is and what it does. Here's the book. Okay, now that you've seen it as a physical object. In our present time, we don't expect a literary dissection to be more than a metaphor for a particularly trenchant critique, nor do we expect a symptomatic reading to refer to actual symptoms. But it was not always so. Romantic Autopsy considers a moment at the turn of the 19th century when British literature and medicine seemed embattled in rivalry to find the two cultures working in unexpected collaboration. My book's main contribution is to reveal how literature and medicine developed interpretive analogies that bridge the fields conceptually. Writers and readers saw fiction and poetry as organic forms, and doctors thought of anatomical features as texts that could be read. Together, Romantic writers, readers, and doctors developed what I call protocols of diagnosis, practices for analytical interpretation that could be used both to diagnose disease in the context of medicine and to understand fiction and poetry in the context of critical reading. In short, Romantic Autopsy makes the case for an interpretive relationship between medical texts and the poetry, prose, and criticism of British Romanticism, with implications for how we continue to read symptomatically in the present day. More on this in a minute. Romantic Autopsy begins by considering the structures of thought that literature and medicine shared during the Romantic century, the era roughly between 1750 to 1850, that is bookended in English literature by Samuel Richardson's Clarissa, a novel that aspires to open and embalm its heroine, and Alfred Tennyson's In Memoriam, an elegy shaped by the rhetoric of the autopsy report. Many essential works of British literature from this period, the lyric poetry of Wordsworth, Keats, and Shelley, the novels of Mary Wollstonecraft, Mary Shelley, and Jane Austen, might seem at first to have little to do with medicine. And yet we can place vital works of poetry and prose, from Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey and Shelley's Adonais to The Wrongs of Woman, Frankenstein, and Pride and Prejudice, in the context of the emergent medical disciplines of the period. In fact, I argue Romantic literature is not just about medicine or affected by medical motifs. More than this, the literature encourages a perspective that we might call diagnostic. Romantic readers are prompted by the texts themselves to dissect poems, to see literary works as organic forms and languages living, to diagnose madness from speech, to cure physical symptoms by reading, and ultimately to derive literary meaning by using the hermeneutics of medicine, an admired but increasingly rival field. During Romanticism, the making of medicine and literature into distinct fields of inquiry, and eventually into academic disciplines, also initiated an exchange across those fields that generated mutually productive terms and ideas. So just in point of example of such a cultural crossover, I will read to you a little bit from the book itself so you can get a flavor of the writing. This is from the introduction. To illustrate the fluidity of the mutual exchange between literature and medicine, let me single out two terms, autopsy and verve, that traveled in opposite directions between the fields at the turn of the 19th century. Reflecting advances in anatomy and pathology during and after the French Revolution, the term autopsy, derived from the ancient Greek autopsia, seeing with one's own eyes, migrated from medicine to become an established technique of poetic criticism. First used in 1805 with respect to the medical postmortem, cadaverous autopsia, the term was being used figuratively by 1835 to mean the examination of a subject or work, moral autopsia. As the 19th century progressed, this figurative sense became even more pronounced in its reference to literary production and criticism. By 1870, Mary Elizabeth Braddon was describing an autopsy of a fine lady's poem. But this cross-cultural influence also ran in the other direction, from literature into medicine. Writerly verve, an indicator of personal style in the Enlightenment art of letters, had by the turn of the 19th century taken on new significance in emergent theories of vitalism, carrying resonances such as energy, vivacity, or go that help to explain biological animation. In Hygeia, written in 1803, the scientist and physician Thomas Beddoes wrote about the actions of the internal organs, that many such processes are carried on with as high a verve or as true fervor as ever accompanied poetic fiction. In their illustrations of two opposite currents in medical literary discourse, autopsy and verve and their underlying concepts of formal organization mark a chiastic interchange between the science of letters and the medical arts. The autopsy, bolstered by new discoveries in the field of clinical pathology, became an experimental practice, not only for understanding the human body, but also for opening up the formal workings of the literary text. The newly medicalized concept of literary verve, meanwhile, offered a model of the text as a living organism that radiated its energy outward for critical observation. The cross movement of autopsy and verve offers a salient example of how tropes of organicism, disease, and examination in Romantic literature can metonymically reveal the more abstract shared ontology that bridged literary and medical cultures. So just stop there. Let me tell you a little bit about the evidence for that shared ontology that I examined in the chapters of the book. Romantic Autopsy shows the variety of medical genres a literary writer might have encountered in their everyday reading, such as physicians' accounts of curious cases, histories of psychiatric patients, and journalistic autopsy reports. Such works in turn inform some of the most familiar novels and poems from the era. In The Prelude in Tintern Abbey, for instance, Wordsworth explores the growth of the poet's mind through a method of self-reading that mimics the anatomical dissections he witnessed in revolutionary France. The great elegies, Percy Shelley's Adonais and Alfred Tennyson's In Memoriam, evoke the body through an anatomical register that had been modeled in the widely available postmortem reports of Princess Charlotte, Napoleon, and Lord Byron. Jane Austen's use of free and direct discourse in Pride and Prejudice has an important precedent in psychiatric case reports written by the director of Bedlam and in Mary Wollstonecraft's novel writing on female insanity. With Frankenstein, Mary Shelley participates in a long tradition of the medical case history as an inherently unreliable genre that extends from Matthew Bailey's 1788 account of situs and versus, which is the reversal of the body's organs, to Sigmund Freud's studies on hysteria. In all these contexts, Romantic Autopsy shows how reading Romantic literature as a medically informed practice reveals a rich substrate of interpretive conventions that the fields shared. The book also raises several questions about the relations between literature and medicine and the enduring bonds that the fields continue to share. Most importantly, what impact do protocols of diagnosis have now on the practice of critical reading? In the coda, I discuss the persistence of Romantic diagnostics in the present day in theoretical debates about how we read symptomatically. Rather than taking aim at symptomatic reading as a throwback to Marxist, Freudian, or structuralist and post-structuralist critiques, My book instead finds new potential for the strategy by reinterpreting it in light of its historical engagement with medicine. The function and value of symptomatic reading might be rehabilitated, I suggest, through a reconsideration that sees it as a rich example of how literary scholarship has historically drawn on and informed its rival cultures. Instead of warning against symptomatic reading, my book is an invitation to revive it. Symptomatic reading has the potential to bridge the fields anew through a cross-disciplinary exegesis that reflects evolving ethical priorities in both modern medical practice and contemporary literary study. Reviving symptomatic reading might afford us a diagnostic protocol of our own. So to sum up, Romantic Autopsy provides an original account of the life and afterlife of Romantic era medicine and literature, while offering a new vision of an interchange that underlies our modern day approaches to the interpretation of literary text. So I will stop now and invite Professor Deidre Lynch to respond first. And thank you everybody for your attention.
Thank you, Arden. I mean, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the book. It's a huge honor to speak about Romantic Autopsy, literary form and medical reading. I will be speaking about it, as Arden suggested, in my guise as a romanticist, a scholar of Romantic era fiction in particular. I won't be talking about the fact that I've known Arden since she was an undergraduate, though I was very tempted to kind of work that in, and maybe in the questions we can deal with that. But so the invitation to speak at this event gave me an alibi over the past week for spending another few days with Arden's deep learning and her agile, clear-sighted prose. This was my second read of Romantic Autopsy. I took as many notes as I did the first time, pages and pages, because this is a book richly studded with gems. It's a book that keeps on giving to its readers. It seems to me that Arden offers a very compelling example of what it means to do the medical humanities as she unearths the affinities in Romantic era Britain that connected literary and critical practices on the one hand, and the contemporary practice of medicine on the other. As she says in a passage that I think of as one of those gems I mentioned before, the Romantic era is a moment when, I quote, medical paradigms gave new context to a literary redefinition of the text as analogous no longer to fabric, as during the Enlightenment, but to organic tissue. The Romantic era is a moment, too, when new periodicals provided a forum for a new sort of exchange across the fields of literature and medicine, and Arden's attention to what periodicals made possible in this era is another eye-opening dimension of her project, I think. In the effort to constitute themselves as autonomous disciplines, these fields of literature and medicine did, over the course of the 19th century, disavow their debts to one another. Nonetheless, they also continued to share formal strategies and protocols of interpretation. Anatomical analyses and probing exegetical readings were, as a consequence, often conceptualized in tandem. Critical readers and physicians used a shared toolkit of protocols of diagnosis, as Arden puts it, techniques for expressing, containing, or diagnosing symptoms located in the body or the text. One thing I admire immensely in Romantic Autopsy is Arden's account of how that symptomatic reading was itself probed and anatomized within some of the most canonical texts of British Romanticism. It's difficult in 2022 to find a way to make Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice seem unfamiliar and surprising, at least to a seasoned literary scholar like myself, but that is just what Arden does here. And I would like to single out for praise that excellent chapter founded on some pioneering archival work with proto-psychiatric casebooks, in which Arden reintroduces us to the free indirect style that so often in our literary histories defines the achievements of Austen's novels. This style, too, which Arden reconceptualizes as a representational protocol that encourages the diagnostic interpretation of a speaker's state of mind, may be seen to travel between fields, and so between mad doctors' casebooks and authors' novels. Arden shows how in Pride and Prejudice, Elizabeth Bennet acts as her sister Lydia's monitor, trying, just as a good doctor might do, to curtail and buffer Lydia's mad speech and laughter. At the same time, Elizabeth, our heroine, is herself the object of the third-person narrator's monitory gaze, fluctuating, therefore, between hypervigilance and shame, not just watching but watched by the moral hierarchies of the text. I'm omitting the details in this rapid fire synopsis, but I'll just say that Arden's attention to those details makes her argument about the medico-political valences of free and direct style compelling. She makes us see Austen anew. Arden also manages to convince her reader to take a second look at the formal strategies that organize another hyper-canonical novel from the period, Shelley's Frankenstein. Who thought there were new things to say about that book? But there is, as Arden shows in her final chapter, in a discussion of a novel that she proposes, amplifies to the point of parody features of the emerging genre of the medical case history. What monstrous effects get created when the narrative proffered by a physician, Dr. Frankenstein, as Hollywood and my undergraduates like to call him, starts to resemble the narrative proffered by this physician's patient, that is, the creature. Arden proposes that the combination of frame narration and inset narration that organizes Shelley's novel, as it does many fictions of the era, is in this particular instance pointedly borrowed from medicine. Arden shows that Shelley takes pains to make our frame narrator an unreliable doctor figure whose commitment to empirical objectivity is imperiled and whose diagnostic procedures are flawed. I found this discussion of Frankenstein really suggestive for other works in the horror tradition, the mad scientist tradition above all. And so this is maybe self-indulgent, but I would love to know what Arden might make of a Victorian work, Sheridan Le Fanu's In a Glass Darkly, published 1872. A great favorite of my own, a set of linked stories which purport to be selected from the cases collected by a certain Dr. Martin Hesselius. One of those cases is that of Carmilla, the lesbian vampire, whose story was adapted for film by Carl Dreyer in 1932. What's especially intriguing, given Arden's interest in the role that a paratextual frame narrative plays in Mary Shelley's novel, is that Martin Hesselius is, in Le Fanu's book, doubled by another nameless figure who appears only in the prologue, Hesselius's secretary and then later his executor. Although educated in surgery, this figure has never actually practiced. He was forced to secede from the calling that engrossed his patron Hesselius when, in the wake of a slip of his own dissecting knife, he suffered a terrible accident and subsequently had 2 fingers amputated. Le Fanu gives us here, as a figure of the authorial hand, a self-dissecting hand. The medical history of our frame narrator, who, as I said, introduces a second frame narrator, Hesselius himself, also seems to capture with remarkable aptness the narrowing of the gulf between the patient's authority and the physician's authority that Arden references as she concludes her final chapter. The doctor, as she insists in that chapter, is not in the literature of this era a figure who can stand apart from the symptom, which might be why medical training might include not just Frankenstein, but In a Glass Darkly as well. Now, it might be a bit self-indulgent of me to use this occasion to call for attention to Le Fanu as a late-breaking contributor to the tradition that Arden reconstructs. But really, Arden, I want you to write about this book. And this is recorded, right? So now my wish is on record. I'm going to continue just a little longer with the self-indulgence to conclude. One of the real gifts of Arden's book overall is the alternative genealogy for the practice of literary criticism that it offers. As you just heard, Arden does not make Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx the origin of modern hermeneutics. She sees symptomatic reading instead as something we inherit from Romantic forebears and something shaped by their engagement with Romantic era medicine. I'll just say this in concluding. One of the burdens that one carries as a critic of Romanticism is that the poets in particular so often appear to see you coming and so often appear to not want you to arrive. Years before you encounter their pages, they're already lamenting critical readers whose profession has them, as Wordsworth said, murdering to dissect. And then there is Keats, a figure who, if Shelley and Byron are to be believed, was snuffed out by an article, who was, in Arden's witty phrase, murdered to dissect. And then there is Coleridge, too, who has a poem in The Keepsake of 1829 titled Chewacritic, who quoted an isolate passage and then declared it unintelligible. And I'm going to try to put this little bit of doggerel poetry into the chat. The line breaks I see have got all messed up by my doing that. Most candid critic, what if I, by way of joke, pluck out your eye and holding up the fragment cry, ha ha, that men such fools should be. Behold this shapeless mass. And he who owned it dreamt that it could see. The joke were mighty analytic. But should you like it, candid critic? I would love to see Arden discuss this poem too. But in her book, Arden isn't reminding us of the discursive context for Coleridge's anti-critical, anti-analytic complaint, simply because she's setting up a postmortem. Romantic Autopsy isn't a postmortem as we normally understand it, because Arden doesn't declare critical reading dead and done, nor does she warn us that it should be dead and gone. Her motives in developing a theory of the protocols of diagnosis are quite different from this. Unlike many such enterprises, Arden's genealogical study means to revive its object. Because of its prehistory and medical literary exchange, she says, symptomatic reading can be used to bridge the fields anew. Because of its ancestry, the practice of symptomatic reading has therapeutic as well as destructive possibilities. I'm very much looking forward to seeing how our field takes these lessons to heart. And I want to thank Arden for teaching us these lessons and many others beside.
Thank you. I think we'll hear next from Professor Rachel Adams. I will respond to everybody at the end.
Well, it has been a true pleasure to read Arden's work, and I want to thank her and the Hyman Center for the opportunity to talk about it tonight. As my colleague Rishi has already suggested, Arden has been so instrumental in shaping medical humanities for undergraduates at Columbia, and she's always bringing in other people to talk about their work. So it's really gratifying to now have a chance to turn the spotlight on her and her own research and writing. When I was invited to speak, I jumped at the chance to read an early copy of Romantic Autopsy. And I imagined, as Arden suggested, I imagined I would appreciate it primarily because I share her interest in the literary aspects of medical humanities. It did not at all disappoint in that respect. As someone who focuses so much on the present, I learned a great deal about the elaborate and evolving affinities between literary and medical epistemes in the late 18th and early 19th century. Romantic Autopsy takes a salutary look back at a time when literature and medicine enjoyed a more fruitful and mutually informative relationship, and it reflects deeply on how those historical insights can be useful to the present, how the generative bonds initially formed in this period can illuminate our reading practices and attitudes toward narrative in the present. Arden's carefully chosen vocabulary for describing this relationship, affinities, interchanges, shared protocols, resonant ideas, congruences, is indicative of the complex approach that refuses a simpler or more unidirectional account of influence or mirroring among the domains of literature and medicine. While I had expected to appreciate the book's contribution to literature and medical humanities, I was more surprised at how the book resonated with another activity I share with Arden, which is teaching literature humanities in Columbia's core curriculum. As many in this audience know, to teach humanities at Columbia often requires walking a tightrope between classes in one's area of expertise and classes that deliberately position the instructor as a non-expert in anything other than the most general understanding of literature. So I want to describe 2 points of particular inspiration that Arden might want to take up further in her response. Now, this is the problem with going second, because I also really seized on the reading of Pride and Prejudice, which I found completely fresh. So forgive me, I'm going to talk about it for about 1 minute. In about 2 weeks, I'll be teaching Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, a novel I love, but is well outside of my literary historical training in 20th century US literature. It also feels quite far from my cultural interests in science, medicine, and human health. These themes are clearly available in prior works like St. Augustine's Confessions, where lust is described as a vivid embodied pathology, Michel de Montaigne's detailed account of his experiences of kidney stones and erectile dysfunction, or Miguel de Cervantes' comic treatment of bodily smells, excretions, and wounding. Then we arrive at Jane Austen, whose characters have more of the closed classical bodies that always seem to invite less conversation about what Tobin Siebers calls complex embodiment. Except when Jane catches a bad cold early in Pride and Prejudice, the novel seemed to me to have not much to say about health or the history of medicine. That is, until I read Arden's illuminating association of Austen's free indirect discourse with the same narrative techniques in psychiatric writing of the time. As a literary critic, I'm used to thinking of free indirect style as a means of accessing a character's interiority as the narrator temporarily zooms in to depict the world filtered through her individual thoughts and impressions. I would not have known, nor would I have thought to look without Arden's guidance toward this device as being prevalent in psychiatric accounts of mad speech at the time. When she proposes, it was a strategy for the doctor to at once represent the patient's pathological mind while also containing and distancing himself from it. I'm totally convinced when Arden then turns to Pride and Prejudice to show how Austen uses this technique to portray Lydia Bennet, the novel's wayward younger daughter, as betraying symptoms of sexual addiction. And as she points out, this introduces the larger problem confronted by respectable citizens of the period, what to do with mentally ill family members, particularly when they act in ways that threaten harm to themselves or others. In Arden's reading, the united Elizabeth and Darcy ultimately assume responsibility for containing Lydia's madness and limiting its impact on others in the family. I love this reading, but I also want Arden's help in clarifying for me, so I can present this to my class in 2 weeks, what you think is at stake when Austen provides this resolution. Is she affirming the values of her protagonists, tasking sane family members with constraining how their ill relatives circulate in public? But I also wonder if in making Lydia's perceived immorality an illness, one that seems to have no particular treatment beyond containment, is there some effort to exonerate her and perhaps by extension to criticize those who would find her morally suspect? And given that Elizabeth had so recently shared some of Lydia's own exuberance and impulsivity, does Austen feel ambivalent about her happy ending, perceiving that something is lost when Lizzie joins Darcy in his strict and judgmental containment of wayward bodies and minds? With this local example, I'm inviting Arden to share further thoughts about what literature, energized by its association with medicine, does in the world. She turns to this question in her conclusion, where she's perhaps, I would say, because I just love this book so much, I think she's a bit modest about what her insights have to offer. In showing the shared origins of the literary and medical diagnostic practices, she contends Romantic Autopsy can redeem symptomatic reading from its tarnished reputation among literary critics. But this prompts her to a new set of questions. If literary narrative can and should be read for its symptoms, where is the cure? If the purpose of medical diagnosis is healing, can the same be said about the effort to identify the etiology of literary devices and narrative forms? She concludes that identifying creative literature with medicine does not ultimately offer healing to the text, its writer, or the reader. This, to my mind, is a very important corrective to the version of humanities that I often see being taken up in medical education, where running counter to the approaches of most literary critics, there is often a sense that the purpose of we read literature for healing and or to provide us with moral guidance. What then does literature do? Romantic Autopsy ends by inviting literary critics to think about more generative alliances with medicine than one limited to narrow practices of healing and cure. I thought of my own work with colleagues in precision medicine, a field of treatment and research based primarily in genetics, which has little to do with symptoms. In its most ideal form, precision medicine aims to detect a body's vulnerabilities and needs in advance, tailoring the avenues to well-being to a given individual's genetic makeup and environment. Now, here's the literary. When I listen to researchers talk about the possible applications of precision medicine, it often feels like speculative fiction. But I also appreciate their recognition of the body's complex and porous interactions with its environment, the limits of a one-size-fits-all treatment protocol, given the particularities of individual bodies, and its more qualified understanding of health. In helping me to see this alignment, a signal accomplishment of Romantic Autopsy then is to recall the historical kinship of medicine and diagnostic literary reading, contributing to a more fluid, provisional, and always imperfect approach to both physiological and narrative well-being. Thank you, Arden.
I think we'll hear next from Dr. Rita Sharon as our last speaker. Go ahead.
Thank you. Now, You might think that I'm here to represent the medical end of things. And I have two snarky things to say about that. One is that there is a tremendous wealth of scientific medical clues in this book that I'm afraid our literary colleagues simply won't get. So in passing, early on in the book, we come across the name Humphrey Davy. Well, Humphrey Davy is he's one of the late country regulars. And he was writing poetry, apparently not very good, under the tutelage of Keats. We know this. But listen, guys, Humphrey Davy is the chemist who isolated potassium. Humphrey Davy is the chemist who isolated, which is to say, like discovered, sodium, chloride, barium, magnesium. This is a guy who put the elements of chemistry on the map. And he gets like a clause. And there are many lacunae. And I'm saying, I sure wish the readers of this book understand the depth of the material that is kind of skimmed, leading me to wonder, what kind of reader is this book written for? When I see, and this is said a couple of times, that 4 disciplines have been chosen as the stars in this book. And the disciplines are anatomy, pathology, psychiatry, and semiotics. That these are the 4 areas that are going to be examined in particular. Well, not a one of them is actually clinical medicine. I mean, certainly not psychiatry, certainly not at that time. So it interested me that there wasn't a deep dive into surgery or into delivering babies or some of the actual medical stuff. Now, I could go on, but that doesn't interest me very much. And indeed, this is a work written by a literary scholar, I think, for literary readers, I think. And I'm curious to know, Arden, who you thought would be reading the text. So I'm gonna switch frame and just have a few words from the side of me that is not an internist but a narratologist. So I look at the form of the book. Arden showed you the book. This is can you see that? This is the cover. It's a painting by Munch. It's called The Sick Child. And it turns out that it was in some way inspired by Munch himself, having lost a sibling, a sister, at a young age to tuberculosis. But the point of showing you the book is that it's really blurry. It's blurry. It's impressionistic. It's blurry. And Arden tells us the definition. I love the definitions that you give us throughout the way. The OED gets more citations than anything. The definition of autopsy is seeing as with one's own eyes. So even the form itself of the book, the cover of the book, is telling us something about how sharp one's own eyes must be and what it means to see something without clarity. How do we see with one's own eyes if indeed the thing being seen is not terribly sharp? And this, of course, is the dilemma all the time with illness. It's simply not very sharp. So we're always seeing as in a blur. Now, I did get a chance to read this in galley because they wanted me to write a comment. And when I first started reading the book, I'm saying, wait a minute, this isn't a dissertation, this is a book. How come the footnotes are so long? What are we doing with all these long discursive footnotes? And it took me a little while to realize sly Arden is using the footnote as David Foster Wallace used the footnote, and as he taught us how, which is to say the footnote is a whole separate avenue toward the reader engaged in not necessarily tangential, but conversations along the boundaries, so that the reader of this book is doing a tremendous amount of work, qua reader, qua paying attention, formally speaking. I mean, we're all new formalists, right? We're old formalists, we're medium formalists, now we're new formalists, we're going to become old formalists again. So just a few more, I mean, I think really it's in the actual construction of some of these sentences that Arden is showing us her bravery. Here, can I read you a couple of sentences? Because bodies and texts were analogized through organicism, analogous principles applied to the analysis of their qualities. Where in the dependent clause, a great big assertion is made. And the reader has to pay great attention to say, wait a minute, and then you're enveloped into the independent clause, or the main clause. Here's another one. Paradoxically, as medicine become more explicitly a domain of natural philosophy rather than the arts, comma, the field's new consciousness of one another's differences produced a more complex and rich interplay. And again, you say, oh, Arden, you snuck one in there. I don't know that medicine used to be thought of as the arts. I don't know. But it gets snuck in. There is a rhetorical force to many of the sentences. I'm talking about sentence structure that propels a kind of collegiality. Okay, I'll go along. Okay, where are you taking me next? Is the kind of appetite that comes from this kind of construction. Your pivotal words dazzle me. You know, all the work that the word protocol is doing. You know, in some ways, protocol is kind of a matter of manners. You know, the fork goes on the left, the knife goes on the right is a protocol. And yet in Arden's hands, it becomes a tenet. So this interests me. And there's a somewhat shape-shifting where in order to become this book's reader, one has to, like with the footnotes, get into conversation with the author in a very, very active way. Now, I'm sure you knew this, Arden. I'm sure you knew what you were doing to us. But I think it's a rhetorical tour de force. I could go on about many of these words that carry the burden of the argument. Organicity is one, disease, diagnosis, sign, symptom. You mentioned Thomas Beddoes before in your comments. Here's one. It's gorgeous, but I don't know quite how you get away with this. So you quote John Brown and Thomas Beddoes. Diagnosis refers to the, quote, doctrine of distinguishing diseases from one another. Okay? And then Arden goes on to say, the way I use the term in this book is slightly broader. Diagnosis is the investigation, determination, and articulation of the nature of a condition. And I'm saying tour de force to, with a phrase, turn disease into a condition, meaning that you can talk about, I don't know, hunger or lust or joy as a disease. It's like so it's not shape shifting. It's opening up what the language is dared to do. That's what it is. And then finally, the nature of the reasoning itself is, I think, maybe the ultimate message to those of us in this field. And you call it out several times. It is analogical reasoning. This is not causal reasoning. This is not, you know, a problem with true, unrelated. You're not talking about cause. You're talking simply about similarity. And then, of course, we pull trusty Foucault into the soup, who reminds us that analogy is an isomorphism of relations between elements. It concerns a system of relations and reciprocal action. This is great. This is great. Isomorphism, smart word. It's used contemporaneously by like organizational methodologists, and they talk about organizational isomorphism as different organizations that share pressure from the same outside sources. So I'm going to leave us with that thought. So an organization can learn from organizations in similar, beset by similar forces, like the market drops, or bitcoins fall off, or COVID comes. So what's the isomorphism between medicine and literature? And this is where Arden's work gets absolutely vast. And she alludes to it toward the end, where indeed the forces of us isomorphic organizations, medicine and literature, are both simultaneously, catastrophically responding. She mentions to the social determinants of health, for example. We can mention the racism baked in to the delivery of health care. These are not disease entities, nor are they literary tropes. They're things out there in the world, and it may indeed be the case that what unites the medicine and the literature in these strange fields of ours is not so much what we make of disease, and not so much that we know that Humphrey Davy invented or discovered potassium, but that we are responding in this world to the catastrophic forces like racism and classism and the failure of this planet to thrive and the despair that power is left in the hands of the wealthy and the autocrats. So I will leave you there. Arden, there is so much thanks to give you. And as I say, I want to thank you for the art of what you're doing in these footnotes and what you're doing in these dependent clauses, and how it is that we as readers are able to learn something qua the reading that we otherwise would never know.
Well, thank you to all three of you for really fascinating and enlightening responses. Rita, I have to process what you've said, and think about it more. What you've done in your comments is actually to extend my argument beyond the point that I had done that into a very interesting new direction. You're seeing the disciplines themselves as organic bodies evolving under pressure, and that the disciplines themselves are adapting to the same external forces. And maybe that is the area in which, if we were to draw an analogy between them, they can be understood as most similar. So that's really interesting, because in the book, I don't go so far as to say that what at the time, what was understood as a field or a culture, not yet a discipline, was itself conceived organically, but very suggestive to think that it could be. So I have to think a lot more about that. That's very interesting. Rachel, I am so happy that you mentioned Lithum, and especially Montaigne, because I was teaching Montaigne today, and we were reading the essay on experience, which is all about his kidney stone and his habits and his bowel movements and everything else. And a line jumped out at me from Montaigne that I wrote down because it was so good. Those who venture to criticize us perform a remarkable act of friendship. For to undertake to wound and offend a man for his own good is to have a healthy love for him.
Yeah.
And I thought that was amazing, because Montaigne is writing in 1580, 200 odd years before the writers that I'm looking at. And yet he is already thinking about criticism as an act of wounding, but also as an act that can restore health. And so we see there prefigured a lot of the arguments that I make through the lens of these emergent medical ideas at the turn of the 19th century. And Rita, you're right to say that they're not exactly clinical specialties. So I have to sort of rephrase that as emergent structures of thought within the medical profession. That's very interesting. I'm very happy that both Rachel and Deidre jumped on the Pride and Prejudice reading as their favorite reading. That was the one that got the most pushback from reviewers along the way, by far. And I had to work really hard to keep it the way I wanted it. And that's the one I'm also most fond of. So I'm very happy that that's the one that stayed with you. Rachel, I was very interested in your questions about the end of the novel and whether there is a kind of ambivalence at the end of the novel. You're saying what's at stake when Austen provides this resolution that Elizabeth and Darcy form this kind of Pemberley asylum cabal to keep their young female relatives in check, and under Georgiana's tutelage, Kitty is vastly improved, and Lydia can visit Elizabeth, but Wickham can never be with her, etc., etc. And it is complicated, as you say rightly, by the fact that Elizabeth had shared some of the passions and impulsivity of Lydia, that they were actually doubled throughout the text. And I think, yes, it contributes to a sense of ambivalence at the end of the novel. People have written a lot about how the marriage plot resolutions at the end of Austen's novels tend to exclude a lot of the energy and possibility that preceded it, and that they're not always a very, there's a sense of melancholy that comes with those endings sometimes. And I think that to follow this argument to its conclusion, yeah, I think that there's a sense that Elizabeth might be giving up a little part of herself in the hypervigilant attitude that she takes through her marriage. Yeah. So I don't want to leave that novel, one of my very, very favorite novels, on such a sad note, though. I would love to think about Deidre's question about Sheridan Le Fanu in A Glass Darkly. So first, I wanted to say you've saved me, because I have just been asked, oh, Arden, would you please contribute a chapter on horror in the 19th century and medicine? And I was like, oh, yeah, I'd like to, but what text am I going to do? So now you've saved me, because I'm going to do this. So thank you. Yeah, really fascinating example. In a slip of his own dissecting knife, he had had 2 fingers amputated. The sense that the nameless writer is someone who is becoming his own patient, the effects of practice upon one's own body, as well the importance of the hand as one of the key metaphorical figures for both dissection and writing. And I talk about this a lot in the book, the hand being the thing that connects the anatomist to the writer, but also that connects the anatomist to God, because God's handiwork is manifested through the beautiful design of the human hand, at least in the beliefs of the period. That's a really fascinating thing that I will have to look at more. I have been thinking a little bit about Carmilla because I would like to think about it in relation to vaccination and women's writing and narratives related to vaccination. I know that that may be a stretch, but I have some incipient ideas about that. So this is an even more wonderful invitation to return not just to that one text in the collection, but actually to the frame narrative. So thank you very much for putting me onto that. I haven't read it in a long time, but I would, yeah, I'm thrilled that you brought it up. I think at this point, we still have a little bit of time. So maybe Jenny, it would be a good moment for you to select some questions from the audience.
Yes, indeed. So thank you all for that. That was wonderful. We're trying to wrap up at 7:30, although I believe I was told before the event started that we could go a few minutes over if we needed to. And let me just take a quick look through. Here's a question that I cannot resist asking on behalf of Catherine Bergevin. In the course of your research, Arden, did you come across any sources regarding or do any thinking about the life of Austen's brother, George, who is believed to have had an intellectual disability and who lived in asylum for much of his life? Do you see potential traces of that family history in Austen's writing?
Right, well, thank you for that great question. And in fact, I did have a pivotal transition in chapter 3 based on that, but the reviewer didn't like it. Typical. Anyway, yes, Jane Austen had a sibling, George, one of her elder brothers. I think it was her third brother, and she's number 7 out of 8. And Deidre, you can correct me on this. And George had an intellectual disability, did not speak. Jane Austen talks in her letters about speaking with my hands. So it's been suggested that she might have known some kind of sign language to communicate with her brother. My understanding of the family history is that her brother was living for most of his life, which was a very long life, with local people in the community. He was living with a family in a community. He was not living with the Austen family. And the wills of the parents, I don't think mentioned him at all. So I think that example, there's very little writing that Austen herself does about that. And it would be a terrible stretch to say anything about psychiatric discourses of control or literary styles or anything like that and the relation to Austen's brother. I think you could not make a causal connection between those things. But it is interesting to read Austen and to think about the period's interest and strategies for dealing with ill family members, and what options are available to you, and thinking about Pride and Prejudice in that lens through the context of Austen's family history. Yeah, it's very interesting. It is not something that I think we have much archival or manuscript evidence for to make a direct connection. Yeah, really good question though.
Thanks for that. A question in a totally different vein from Chidera Udebibia, who says, "Hi Arden, congratulations on your book. How long did it take you to write it, and what could you tell us about what the writing process was like?"
So thank you. That's a great question. Hi, Chidera. Chidera is one of my former students, and I am very happy that you came to the event tonight. This is so nice. So the book began as a PhD dissertation, which I wrote at Columbia and completed in 2016. I completely rethought elements of the project and oriented it within medical humanities when I was doing a postdoctoral fellowship at the Society of Fellows and Heyman Center for the Humanities. And most of the revision along those lines took place from 2016 to 2019. And then final engagement tussles with reviewers took about 2.5 years. And yeah, it was a intensive review, and finally was accepted last winter, a year of production, and here we are. So the whole project from start to finish probably took about 7 years, with the most powerful incubation occurring over maybe about a 3-year period. Yeah, and what the writing process was like. Well, I remained attached to the project and enthusiastic about the project the entire time, which I think is very, very fortunate. The most rewarding parts for me were probably being able to present work in progress at conferences and to get input from fellow scholars throughout. A lot of the archival research I was doing was also really interesting to me and very rewarding. The revision of the book, as I mentioned, was lengthy, and that was great because it really allowed me to clarify the fact that the relationship between literature and medicine in the Romantic period was not one of causal influence, but was happening in these analogical spaces. And in fact, the evidence of such analogies and affinities existing between the fields, the comparisons that we can make between them, was itself a kind of historical evidence for their interconnection. So that was a very important intervention for me, and that was clarified through the review.
Thank you. Several questions from Isabel Burkhaw, but I think I'll stick with the opening one. When and how did you first discover the correlation between literary and medical dissection?
That is a very wonderful question. Well, I think I always had an ear attuned to this. Maybe since listening to Jagged Little Pill by Alanis Morissette, where she says, I'm not going to dissect everything today. And once you start paying attention to it, you hear the word dissection applied in a metaphorical sense all the time. And when I came to read Wordsworth, a poem called The Tables Turned, he has this very famous line, we murder to dissect. And I thought, wow, what a line, we murder to dissect. And that was used in reference to a reader who was murdering to dissect, who was destroying the literary work in order to pick it apart. And that I found such a rich and evocative phrase that was what led me to consider, okay, is Wordsworth for science? Is he against it? What is the relationship of literature to medicine and to the sciences more broadly during this period? Because medicine is science at all in this period. So that was the poem that began it all. But then, again, once you start seeing it, you find it everywhere. Yeah.
So there are two more questions, and I think we can do both of them, and perhaps we'll close to further questions. One follows up, I think, quite well on the things you've already been talking about. This is a question from Sky Savage, who asks, what was the archival aspect of the work like? How did you approach it coming from a literature department? And Sky adds, asking as someone also coming from literature and interested in looking in medical archives.
That's a great question. And Sky, thank you for asking that question. Well, I was very lucky to be able to see many of the records of the Wellcome collection and even to access the Wellcome collection during the pandemic online. I had to do some archival research in the late stages of editing, and things were closed. So luckily the Wellcome collection was full of really well-organized resources for me, especially in the psychiatric case histories. I did some crucial site visits. The most important one was to the University of Glasgow at the Hunterian collection, which is this incredible collection of anatomical models that's preserved, but also of medical texts and manuscripts. And so I ended up spending a lot of time there transcribing manuscripts from the 18th century. I did some visits to the Orkney Islands to also do some archival collection up there. What is my takeaway from approaching the archives as a literary scholar? I think I had a very clear sense in my own mind of the epistemological frame that I was going to apply to those archives, which was that I was interested in rhetoric and form. I was interested in the expression of patient stories and the representation from the practitioner of patient stories. And so that probably colored how I approached the texts themselves in the archive. Yeah. And so I think it was important to start with the clear sense of what my own discipline was looking for. And then I was able to parse through it pretty well. But some things were purely luck. And especially finding free and direct style in some of the psychiatric case histories from the late 18th century that was pure luck. And then being able to sort of see it in more different psychiatric records across different, ranges of disciplines or specializations within psychiatry in that period, that was very fortunate. So some things was just like the miracle of the archive yielding things. But also, like, I knew rhetoric and form was the thing that was most interesting to me.
A final question then from Aubrey Gabel. Can you give an example of how symptomatic reading can be used today without seeming old-fashioned?
That's a very hard question. That's a very tall order. That's a very tall order. Well, as I say in the coda of the book, which is more suggestive, I think, than prescriptive, the great tendency in contemporary times has been to say, we're not particularly interested in symptomatic reading because it's, invasive and it's probing the literary text for evidence that there's some hidden meaning. And instead we should just see what the text is saying. Why are we looking for hidden meanings? Well, I think that, and this is in relation to some of the things that Rita has said, having a recognition of the structural systems that shape our disciplines, the structural systems that shape our society, the forms of oppression that exist and abjection that exist, is dependent on being able to make a link between the external manifestation and the underlying cause. So that's symptomatic reading. So I think cultural critique, in fact, is based on a similar movement of thought. And that would be a very pressing and contemporary setting in which this is occurring. I think I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Arden, and thanks to everybody in the audience for being here. It was an amazing turnout. Everyone who hosted and everyone who was a panelist or a part of this conversation here today. It was a wonderful one, and I hope you'll join with me in a final round of applause for Arden and her wonderful book.